Medieval Europe was a tapestry woven from countless threads of tradition, custom, and necessity. Picture, if you will, a time when the world moved at the pace of horse hooves on cobblestone, when candles flickered in stone chambers, and when the very fabric of society was held together by an intricate web of laws that seem wonderfully strange to our modern eyes. In the years between 800 and 1500, across the rolling hills of England, the vast forests of Germany, the sun-drenched vineyards of France, and the bustling trade routes of Italy, countless communities developed their own unique approaches to justice and order. These weren't the sterile, uniform legal codes we know today, but rather living, breathing systems that grew organically from the soil of human experience. The medieval world was fundamentally different from ours in ways that are both profound and charmingly mundane. Time itself was measured differently, not by precise clocks, but by the ringing of church bells, the crowing of roosters, and the movement of shadows across sundials. In this gentler rhythm of life, laws too had a different character. They were often poetic, sometimes whimsical, and always deeply rooted in the practical realities of daily existence. Consider the England of the 12th century, where King Henry II was establishing what would become known as common law. The countryside was dotted with small villages, each perhaps home to no more than a few hundred souls. These communities were largely self-governing, with their own courts and customs that had been passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. In these village courts, which often met beneath ancient oak trees or in the nave of the local church, justice was administered with a combination of practical wisdom and what we might now consider endearing eccentricity. The laws they enforced were not abstract principles, but concrete responses to the challenges of agricultural life, trade disputes, and the eternal human struggles of getting along with one's neighbors. The very concept of law in medieval times was beautifully intertwined with concepts of honor, community harmony, and divine will. Unlike our modern legal system, which strives for objectivity and uniformity, medieval law was comfortable with subjectivity and local variation. A law that made perfect sense in a fishing village on the North Sea might be completely irrelevant to a mountain community in the Alps, and this was understood and accepted. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval law was its relationship with the natural world. Many legal proceedings were tied to the cycles of seasons, the phases of the moon, and the rhythms of agricultural life. Court sessions were often scheduled around harvest time, and certain types of disputes could only be heard during specific seasons. This created a legal system that breathed with the natural world, expanding and contracting like a living organism. The penalties prescribed by medieval law were often as creative as they were practical. Rather than simply imposing fines or imprisonment, medieval courts frequently devised punishments that were specifically tailored to the crime, the criminal, and the community's needs. These punishments often had a theatrical quality, designed not just to penalize the wrongdoer, but to reinforce community values and provide a form of collective catharsis. In the great legal traditions of medieval Europe, we find the Romano-Germanic tradition, which grew from the rediscovered texts of ancient Roman law, carefully preserved and studied in the monasteries and early universities. This tradition emphasized written codes and scholarly interpretation, creating a legal culture that valued learning and precision. Alongside this learned tradition flourished the common law systems, particularly in England, which grew organically from local customs and the practical decisions of traveling judges. These judges, riding circuit through the countryside, would arrive in villages like gentle harbingers of order, setting up temporary courts in whatever space was available. Sometimes a lord's great hall, sometimes a marketplace, sometimes simply under the spreading branches of a familiar tree. The interaction between these different legal traditions created a rich ecosystem of law that was both surprisingly sophisticated and delightfully human in its quirks and contradictions. In some regions, legal disputes could be settled through combat, trial by ordeal, or the sworn testimony of one's neighbors. In others, complex written procedures governed everything from commercial transactions to marriage contracts. Medieval lawmakers were often dealing with problems that are timeless: how to ensure fair trade, how to maintain public order, how to resolve disputes between neighbors. But they approached these challenges with solutions that were uniquely shaped by their time and place. The result was a legal landscape as varied and colorful as a medieval tapestry, full of unexpected details and charming peculiarities. As we prepare to explore these fascinating legal traditions, imagine yourself as a peaceful observer in this gentler world, where law was not merely a system of rules, but a way of weaving human communities together. In the candlelit chambers where medieval lawyers studied their texts, in the village squares where courts convened, in the monastery scriptoriums where ancient legal wisdom was preserved and transmitted, there was a quality of thoughtful deliberation that our hurried modern world has largely forgotten. As we step more deeply into the world of medieval law, imagine yourself walking along a well-worn path that leads through the heart of a 13th century European town. The morning mist is just beginning to lift from the thatched roofs, and the first sounds of daily life are stirring. The gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture, the rhythmic hammering of the blacksmith already at work, the soft murmur of voices as merchants begin to arrange their wares in the market square. This is the world where our strange and wonderful laws took shape, born from the practical needs of people who lived closer to the earth and to each other than we do today. Every law we're about to explore emerged from real human situations: disputes over boundary stones, questions about the quality of bread, concerns about the proper behavior of apprentices, disagreements over the rights to gather firewood in the Lord's forest. The first thing that strikes you about medieval legal culture is how public and communal it was. Justice was not something that happened behind closed doors in sterile courtrooms, but rather a community affair that often took place in the very heart of daily life. Picture the market square on a typical morning, with its wooden stalls displaying grain, cloth, pottery, and tools. This same space might transform in the afternoon into an open-air courtroom, where the entire community could witness the administration of justice. The air in such a place would be filled with the sense of medieval life: fresh bread from the baker's ovens, the earthy smell of animals and agriculture, the sweet fragrance of herbs growing in monastery gardens, and the woody smoke from countless hearth fires. These were the sensory backdrops against which medieval law unfolded, creating an atmosphere where legal proceedings felt integrated into the fabric of life rather than separated from it. In this setting, we encounter our first category of strange medieval laws, those concerning the regulation of daily crafts and trades. These laws reveal a society that was intensely concerned with quality, fairness, and the maintenance of community standards. Consider, for instance, the elaborate regulations governing bakers. In medieval England, bakers who sold underweight loaves faced a punishment called the pillory, but the process of determining guilt was itself a kind of community ritual. The suspected baker would be brought to the market square, where his bread would be weighed on the public scales. If found wanting, he might be placed in the pillory, not as a form of cruel punishment, but as a way of acknowledging to the community that quality standards have been violated and would be maintained. The pillory itself was often decorated with symbolic elements related to the baker's trade, turning the punishment into a kind of educational theater about the importance of honest dealing. But perhaps even more fascinating were the laws governing the quality of ale, which was a staple beverage in medieval times when water was often unsafe to drink. Alewives, the women who brewed and sold ale in their homes, were subject to a delightful system of quality control known as ale tasting. Community members would be appointed as official ale tasters, whose job it was to sample the ale produced by each household and determine whether it met community standards. Imagine the gentle ritual of ale tasting. The taster arriving at a cottage door on a sunny afternoon, being welcomed inside where the aroma of fresh bread mingles with the yeasty scent of brewing ale. The taster would sample the ale thoughtfully, perhaps engaging in pleasant conversation about the weather, the harvest, or local news. If the ale was deemed satisfactory, a small mark would be made on the doorpost. If not, the alewife would receive gentle guidance on how to improve her brewing technique. These laws created a system where community members looked after each other's welfare in very practical ways. The ale-tasting laws weren't designed to punish, but to ensure that everyone in the community had access to wholesome drink. They fostered a culture of mutual responsibility and shared expertise, where the knowledge of good brewing was treated as a valuable community resource. Another charming category of medieval law dealt with the regulation of animals within the community. In a world where livestock shared living space with humans, where geese wandered freely through village streets, and where pigs serve as living garbage disposals, detailed laws governing animal behavior were essential for community harmony. Consider the laws regarding stray pigs, which were a common sight in medieval villages. These weren't wild boars, but domestic pigs that served the important function of cleaning up organic waste from the streets. However, when pigs strayed from their designated areas or caused damage to gardens or other property, a charming system of pig courts would convene. The pig court was exactly what it sounds like, a legal proceeding specifically dedicated to resolving disputes involving pigs. The pig itself would often be brought before the court, not to be judged, for medieval law recognized that animals couldn't be held morally responsible for their actions, but so that the facts of the case could be clearly established. Witnesses would testify about what they had seen, property damage would be assessed, and a fair resolution would be reached. These proceedings had a wonderful theatrical quality. Picture a sunny afternoon in the village square, with the defendant pig being led in on a rope, perhaps grunting and snuffling in confusion at all the attention. The pig's owner would stand nearby, ready to accept responsibility and make amends. Community members would gather around, not just to witness justice being done, but to participate in a ritual that reinforced the importance of being good neighbors and responsible community members. The punishments in pig court were typically practical rather than punitive. The pig's owner might be required to repair damaged property, provide compensation to injured parties, or take specific measures to prevent future problems. Sometimes the solution would be as simple as building a better fence or establishing new routines for supervising the animals. What made these laws particularly charming was their recognition that both humans and animals were integral parts of the community fabric. Rather than simply banning pigs from village life, medieval law sought to find ways for different species to coexist harmoniously. This reflects a worldview that saw law not as a set of rigid prohibitions, but as a flexible tool for fostering community well-being. As we continue our gentle exploration of medieval legal traditions, we begin to see how these seemingly strange laws actually represent sophisticated solutions to the practical challenges of community life. They were crafted by people who understood that law at its best serves to strengthen the bonds between community members, rather than simply to prohibit and punish. The afternoon light slants golden through the narrow windows of the medieval world we are visiting, casting long shadows across the cobblestone squares where these legal dramas played out. In this gentle light, the strange laws of medieval Europe begin to reveal their deeper wisdom. Their recognition that human communities are delicate ecosystems that require careful tending, creativity, and a good dose of humor to flourish. As the medieval day progresses into afternoon, we find ourselves drawn deeper into the fascinating world of legal theater that characterized so much of medieval justice. The warm afternoon sun filters through the narrow streets, casting intricate patterns of light and shadow on the stone walls of the courthouse, the market square, and the various other venues where justice was administered with such creativity and community involvement. In medieval times, the administration of justice was understood to be not merely a practical necessity, but a form of sacred drama that helped maintain the spiritual and social order of the community. Every legal proceeding was, in a sense, a performance designed to reinforce community values, demonstrate the consequences of antisocial behavior, and provide cathartic release for community tensions. One of the most extraordinary examples of this theatrical approach to justice was the medieval tradition of animal trials. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals were actually put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal procedures, and solemn verdicts. These trials weren't expressions of primitive thinking, but rather sophisticated attempts to grapple with questions of responsibility, community order, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. Picture, if you will, a courtroom in 16th century France, where a sow and her 6 piglets have been charged with the murder of child. The courtroom is filled with the warm, golden light of afternoon candles, and the air carries the faint scent of beeswax and the earthy smells of a rural community. The sow, who has been deemed the primary culprit, sits in the dock with her piglets nearby, all wearing specially crafted human clothing for the occasion. The trial proceeds with all the solemnity and careful procedure of any human trial. A lawyer has been appointed to represent the pigs, and he argues their case with genuine passion and legal expertise. He points out that the pigs were acting according to their nature, that they had not been properly supervised, and that the true responsibility lies with the humans who failed in their duty of care. The prosecutor, meanwhile, argues that the community's safety requires a clear response to this tragedy, and that allowing such behavior to go unpunished would set a dangerous precedent. Witnesses testify about what they observed. Evidence is carefully examined, and legal precedents are cited with scholarly precision. After due deliberation, the court renders its verdict. The mother sow is found guilty and sentenced to death, while the piglets are acquitted on grounds of their youth and the corrupting influence of their mother. The execution is carried out with the same ceremony as would be used for a human criminal, complete with formal dress for the condemned animal and a gathering of the entire community to witness justice being done. To modernize, this might seem absurd, but these animal trials served several important functions in medieval society. They provided a formal mechanism for communities to process traumatic events. They reinforced the principle that all harmful actions must be acknowledged and addressed, and they demonstrated that justice was a cosmic principle that extended beyond the human realm. More importantly, these trials often serve as a form of communal therapy, allowing communities to work through their fears, anger, and grief in a structured, ritualized way. The careful legal procedures and solemn ceremony help transform chaotic emotions into ordered responses, creating a sense that justice had been done and that the community could move forward. Another fascinating category of medieval justice was the system of trial by ordeal, which reveals the deeply spiritual worldview that underpinned medieval law. These trials were based on the belief that divine providence would intervene to protect the innocent and expose the guilty. While we might now see these as superstitious practices, they actually represented sophisticated attempts to grapple with the fundamental problem of uncertainty in legal proceedings. Consider the ordeal by hot iron, which was commonly used in medieval England. The accused person would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually about 9 steps. Their hand would then be bandaged and sealed, and after 3 days, the bandage would be removed. If the hand had healed cleanly, the person was deemed innocent. If infection or other complications had developed, they were considered guilty. The procedure surrounding this ordeal was elaborate and deeply reverent. The trial would take place in a church, often before the altar, with the entire community gathered as witnesses. Prayers would be offered, hymns sung, and the hot iron would be blessed by the priest. The accused would often spend days in fasting and prayer, preparing spiritually for the trial. From a modern perspective, we might assume that this was simply a brutal practice that randomly harmed innocent people. But recent historical research suggests that the ordeal system may have been more sophisticated than it first appears. The elaborate preparation, the community involvement, and the spiritual framework all created psychological pressure that may have encouraged genuine confessions before the ordeal took place. Moreover, the priests who administered these ordeals had considerable discretion in how they conducted the procedure. A priest who suspected that an accused person was innocent might allow the iron to cool slightly before it was used, or might provide better medical care during the healing period. In this way, the ordeal system provided a mechanism for incorporating community wisdom and clerical judgment into the judicial process. The ordeal by water was another common procedure, and it too had a kind of poetic logic to it. The accused would be bound and lowered into a body of blessed water. If they floated, they were considered guilty, the pure water rejecting their sinful body, and if they sank, they were innocent, the water accepting them. Of course, if they sank too deeply, they might drown, but the procedure usually included provisions for quickly pulling innocent people back to safety. What's particularly interesting about these ordeals is how they were integrated into the broader spiritual and social life of medieval communities. They weren't arbitrary punishments, but rather sacred rituals that helped communities grapple with moral uncertainty. They provided a way of consulting divine wisdom when human wisdom proved insufficient, and they created powerful moments of communal bonding and spiritual reflection. The gradual decline of trial by ordeal in the 12th and 13th centuries reflects broader changes in medieval culture. The growth of universities, the rediscovery of classical learning, and the development of more sophisticated legal reasoning. But even as these older forms of justice gave way to newer approaches, they left their mark on the medieval legal imagination. Perhaps nowhere is the theatrical nature of medieval justice more evident than in the elaborate ceremonies that surrounded the punishment of crimes. Rather than simply imposing penalties behind closed doors, medieval communities created public spectacles that were designed to educate, entertain, and reinforce social values. Consider the punishment known as carding, which was commonly used for various moral offenses. The offender would be placed on a cart and driven slowly through the streets of the town, while community members would gather to observe and sometimes to participate by shouting criticisms or throwing harmless objects. But this wasn't merely mob justice. It was a carefully orchestrated community ritual. The route of the cart would be predetermined, stopping at significant locations: the market square, the church, the offender's place of work or residence. At each stop, there might be a brief ceremony or speech explaining the nature of the offense and the importance of community standards. The offender might be given an opportunity to apologize and seek forgiveness from the community. What made this punishment particularly effective was its emphasis on reintegration rather than simply retribution. The goal wasn't to destroy the offender or drive them from the community, but rather to publicly acknowledge the wrongdoing and create an opportunity for the offender to demonstrate their commitment to community values. After completing their public penance, the offender would typically be welcomed back into full community membership. The physical environment of these punishments was carefully chosen to enhance their symbolic impact. The pillory, for instance, was often located in the market square, where the largest number of people would naturally gather. But it was also positioned to create specific visual relationships, perhaps facing the church to emphasize the spiritual dimensions of justice, or positioned near the town scales to highlight issues of commercial honesty. As afternoon deepens into early evening in our medieval town, the shadows grow longer and the quality of light becomes softer and more golden. In this gentle twilight, the strange laws and customs we've been exploring begin to reveal their deeper wisdom. They show us a world where justice was understood not as an abstract principle, but as a living practice that helped bind communities together through shared ritual, mutual responsibility, and collective wisdom. As evening approaches in our medieval journey, we find ourselves drawn to one of the most remarkable institutions of medieval law: the concept of sanctuary. Picture, if you will, walking through the narrow streets, as the last light of day fades behind the tall stone walls of the cathedral. The air is growing cooler now, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from evening hearth fires and the lingering aroma of the day's bread baking. The great cathedral doors stand open, as they always did in medieval times, and warm light spills out onto the stone steps. Inside, candles flicker before ancient altars, creating an atmosphere of peace and timeless serenity. This sacred space represents one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval law, the recognition that justice sometimes requires mercy, and that even the most serious criminals deserve a chance for redemption. The law of sanctuary was both simple and profound. Any person who reached the sacred precincts of a church, cathedral, or monastery could claim protection from secular authorities. Once within the sanctuary, they could not be arrested, tried, or punished by civil courts. This wasn't a loophole or an oversight in the legal system. It was a deliberate and carefully crafted recognition that divine mercy should always have a place alongside human justice. Imagine a fugitive arriving at the cathedral doors just as the evening bells begin to toll. Perhaps he is a merchant accused of fraud, or a peasant who struck his lord in anger, or a woman accused of witchcraft. Regardless of the accusation, the moment he crosses the threshold into the sacred space, he enters a different realm, a place where the harsh demands of worldly justice are tempered by the infinite compassion of divine love. The sanctuary wasn't simply a hiding place. It was a space for reflection, repentance, and transformation. The fugitive would typically remain in the church for 40 days, during which time he would participate in the spiritual life of the community. He would attend daily prayers, receive instruction from the clergy, and engage in contemplation of his past actions and future possibilities. During these 40 days, the fugitive would also have the opportunity to negotiate with his accusers, often with the mediation of the church authorities. Many disputes that had seemed irreconcilable in the heat of passion could be resolved through patient discussion, prayer, and the passage of time. The sanctuary provided a cooling-off period that allowed all parties to step back from their immediate emotions and consider more constructive responses. The physical environment of the sanctuary was carefully designed to promote this kind of spiritual reflection. The soaring stone arches, the colored light filtering through stained glass windows, the gentle echo of footsteps on ancient flagstones. All of these elements created an atmosphere that encouraged contemplation and inner transformation. The fugitive would often sleep on the stone floor near the altar, wrapped in simple blankets provided by the church, experiencing a form of voluntary poverty that helped put worldly concerns into perspective. If, after 40 days, no reconciliation had been achieved, the fugitive faced a choice. He could emerge from sanctuary and face trial by the secular authorities, or he could choose to leave the realm entirely, promising never to return. This second option, known as abjuration, was itself a fascinating legal ritual. The ceremony of abjuration would take place at the church doors, with representatives of both church and state present as witnesses. The fugitive would formally renounce his allegiance to the realm, surrender any property or titles he might hold, and swear a solemn oath never to return. He would then be given a wooden cross to carry and a letter of safe passage, and would begin his journey to the nearest port, where he would take ship for foreign lands. The journey to the port was itself ritualized. The fugitive, now technically in exile, would follow designated roads and stay only in specified places. Local authorities were required to provide him with basic sustenance and protection, ensuring that his departure from the realm was accomplished safely. If he deviated from the prescribed route or attempted to contact friends or family, he would forfeit his protection and could be killed with impunity. This system of sanctuary and abjuration reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Medieval lawyers recognized that many crimes arose from momentary passion rather than fundamental evil, and that even serious offenders might be redeemed through proper spiritual guidance. The sanctuary provided a mechanism for distinguishing between hardened criminals and those who had simply made serious mistakes in moments of weakness. The sanctuary laws also served important social functions beyond their immediate purpose. They provided a safety valve that prevented blood feuds from spiraling out of control, since family members knew that their relatives could find protection if circumstances became desperate. They reinforced the moral authority of the church by demonstrating its commitment to mercy and forgiveness. And they created powerful symbols of hope and redemption that helped maintain social cohesion even in times of conflict. But perhaps most importantly, the sanctuary laws embodied a profound theological principle, the belief that no human being was beyond the reach of divine grace. In a world where justice was often harsh and unforgiving, the sanctuary provided a tangible reminder that mercy was always possible, that transformation was always achievable, and that the ultimate purpose of law was not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to restore right relationships within the community. The physical spaces that provided sanctuary were themselves carefully regulated by law. Not every religious building could offer protection. Only those that had been specifically consecrated for this purpose, and only those whose boundaries had been clearly defined and legally recognized. Some sanctuaries extended only to the interior of the church building, while others included the entire churchyard or even substantial surrounding territory. The most famous sanctuary in medieval England was at Westminster Abbey, whose boundaries extended far beyond the Abbey Church itself to include a substantial portion of what is now central London. Within these boundaries, a complex community of fugitives, debtors, and other refugees developed its own customs and governance structures. The Abbey sanctuary became a kind of city within a city, with its own markets, workshops, and social hierarchies. These sanctuary communities were fascinating examples of medieval social experimentation. Freed from the normal constraints of feudal hierarchy and civil law, residents developed innovative approaches to governance, trade, and community organization. They created mutual aid societies, established informal courts to resolve disputes, and developed new forms of craft production that took advantage of their unique legal status. The laws governing sanctuary reveal another important aspect of medieval legal thinking: the recognition that different types of law served different purposes and operated in different spheres. Civil law was concerned with maintaining social order and protecting property rights. Canon law, the law of the church, was concerned with spiritual welfare and moral transformation. The sanctuary laws created a space where these different legal systems could interact and sometimes override each other in service of higher principles. As we sit quietly in this ancient sanctuary, surrounded by the gentle flicker of candlelight and the soft whispers of evening prayers, we can begin to appreciate the profound wisdom embedded in these medieval institutions. The sanctuary laws weren't simply about protecting criminals. They were about creating space for redemption, maintaining hope in the face of despair, and ensuring that mercy always had a place alongside justice. The stone walls around us have witnessed countless dramas of human frailty and divine grace. Here, murderers have found peace, thieves have discovered honesty, and desperate souls have encountered the transformative power of unconditional love. The sanctuary was a place where the harsh realities of medieval life were softened by the infinite compassion of divine mercy, creating a space where even the most broken individuals could begin to heal. As evening settles more deeply around our sanctuary, the outside world fades away, and we are left with the timeless rhythm of prayer and contemplation that has sustained this sacred space for centuries. In this quiet refuge, the strange laws of medieval Europe reveal their deepest purpose, not merely to regulate behavior or punish wrongdoing, but to create communities where human dignity is preserved and divine love can transform even the hardest hearts. As we move deeper into the evening of our medieval exploration, Imagine stepping from the sacred precincts of a sanctuary into the quieter commercial districts of our medieval town. The air is cooler now, carrying with it the earthy scents of herbs and vegetables from the market gardens that lie just beyond the town walls. In this peaceful transition between day and night, we encounter some of the most charming and practical examples of medieval legal wisdom, the elaborate laws that govern commerce and trade. Medieval commercial law reveals a society that was both deeply practical and wonderfully imaginative in its approach to economic regulation. Far from being primitive or unsophisticated, these laws demonstrate a nuanced understanding of human psychology, market dynamics, and community welfare that would impress modern economists and business ethicists alike. Consider, for instance, the delightful laws governing the sale of fish in medieval London. The Thames was a major source of fresh fish for the city, and the fish markets were among the most important commercial venues. But ensuring that fish remained fresh in an age without refrigeration presented unique challenges that medieval lawmakers addressed with characteristic creativity and attention to detail. The law required that all fish be sold within specific time limits based on the season, the type of fish, and the weather conditions. During summer months, when fish spoiled quickly, sellers had to dispose of their wares by a certain hour of the day, after which any remaining fish had to be given away to the poor rather than sold. This wasn't simply a public health measure. It was a sophisticated social policy that ensured food safety while also providing for the needy. But the fish laws went far beyond simple time limits. They established detailed requirements for how fish should be displayed, handled, and transported. Fish sellers had to arrange their wares in specific patterns that made it easy for customers to judge freshness. They were required to keep their fish in clean, well-ventilated spaces and to use specific types of containers that wouldn't contaminate the product. The enforcement of these laws involved the entire community. Appointed fish inspectors would make regular rounds of the markets, but ordinary citizens were also encouraged to report violations. The punishments for selling spoiled fish were both practical and theatrical. The offending seller might be forced to stand in the pillory while the spoiled fish was burned publicly, creating a memorable demonstration of the importance of honest dealing. What made these laws particularly sophisticated was their recognition that different types of fish required different handling procedures. The laws distinguished between saltwater and freshwater fish, between large and small fish, between fish caught locally and fish transported from distant waters. Each category had its own specific regulations, reflecting a deep understanding of the practical challenges involved in maintaining quality throughout the supply chain. The laws governing bread sales were equally elaborate and revealed the central importance of this staple food in medieval life. Bread was not merely a commodity, but a cornerstone of social order, and its quality and availability were matters of vital community concern. The assize of bread, one of the most comprehensive pieces of commercial legislation in medieval England, established detailed standards for bread production that covered everything from the quality of grain to the size and weight of finished loaves. The law required that bread be sold in standardized sizes and weights, with the price varying according to the current cost of grain. This created a system that protected consumers from price manipulation while ensuring that bakers could maintain reasonable profits. The standardization was enforced through regular inspections by appointed bread weighers, who would visit each bakery with official scales and measuring devices. But the bread laws also included provisions that seem wonderfully humane by modern standards. Bakers who produced underweight loaves weren't simply fined or punished. They were required to make restitution by providing additional bread to their customers. The law recognized that honest mistakes could occur, and it focused on correcting problems rather than simply punishing errors. More remarkably, the bread laws included provisions for times of scarcity. During famines or other emergencies, bakers were required to continue producing bread even if they couldn't obtain their usual profit margins. The community had a responsibility to support bakers during these difficult times, But bakers also had a responsibility to ensure that bread remained available to all community members. The regulation of ale and beer production reveals another fascinating aspect of medieval commercial law. Its recognition that economic activity should serve broader social purposes. Alewives, the women who brewed and sold ale in their homes, were subject to comprehensive regulations that covered not only the quality of their product, but also their responsibilities to the community. These regulations required alewives to maintain clean brewing equipment, use quality ingredients, and sell their ale at fair prices. But they also required alewives to serve as unofficial social workers, providing food and shelter to travelers, offering credit to community members in need, and maintaining their establishments as safe gathering places for neighborhood social life. The enforcement of ale regulations involved the charming institution of ale tasters, community members who were appointed to sample the ale produced by each household and certify its quality. But ale tasting was more than a simple quality control measure. It was a social ritual that reinforced community bonds and ensured that everyone felt included in the economic life of the town. Picture an ale taster making his rounds on a pleasant evening, stopping at each household where ale was produced. He would be welcomed inside, offered a seat by the fire, and invited to sample the day's production. The conversation might touch on local news, family matters, or community concerns. If the ale met standards, the taster would mark the door with a special sign. If not, he would offer gentle advice about brewing techniques or ingredient quality. This system created a web of social relationships that went far beyond simple commercial transactions. The ale taster got to know every family in his district, understand their circumstances, and provide informal counseling and support. The alewives became central figures in community life, serving not only as producers of a vital commodity, but as informal community leaders and social coordinators. Medieval commercial law also included elaborate regulations governing craft production, which reveal a sophisticated understanding of quality control, worker protection, and technological innovation. The guild system, which organized craftsmen into professional associations, created detailed standards for everything from the training of apprentices to the quality of finished products. Consider the laws governing the production of cloth, one of medieval Europe's most important industries. These laws established standards for the quality of raw materials, the techniques used in weaving and dyeing, and the dimensions and characteristics of finished cloth. They also regulated working conditions, ensuring that apprentices received proper training and that master craftsmen maintained reasonable production schedules. But the cloth laws went beyond simple technical standards. They also addressed broader questions of innovation and tradition. New techniques and materials had to be approved by guild authorities before they could be used commercially, ensuring that changes didn't compromise quality or safety. At the same time, the laws encouraged experimentation and improvement, offering rewards for innovations that benefited the craft as a whole. The guild system also included comprehensive provisions for social welfare. Guild members contributed to common funds that supported widows and orphans, provided care for sick or disabled craftsmen, and maintained quality standards even during difficult economic times. The laws governing these mutual aid societies were detailed and sophisticated, creating early forms of social insurance that protected community members throughout their lives. As evening deepens around us, and the sounds of commercial activity gradually give way to the quieter rhythms of domestic life, we can appreciate the remarkable sophistication of medieval commercial law. These weren't arbitrary restrictions imposed by distant authorities, but rather carefully crafted systems that emerged from practical experience and deep understanding of human nature. The laws we've explored reveal a commercial culture that valued quality over quantity, community welfare over individual profit, and long-term sustainability over short-term gain. They created economic systems that were both efficient and humane, competitive and cooperative, traditional and innovative. In the gentle evening light filtering through the windows of the medieval shops and workshops around us, we can see how these commercial laws helped create communities where economic activity served broader social purposes. They remind us that commerce at its best is not merely about the exchange of goods and services, but about the creation and maintenance of relationships that bind communities together in mutual support and shared prosperity. As full evening settles over our medieval town, we find ourselves drawn to perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval law, the elaborate and often surprising procedures that governed legal proceedings themselves. The courthouse, a sturdy stone building nestled between the cathedral and the market square, glows softly in the light of oil lamps and candles. Inside, the high-beamed ceiling and thick walls create an atmosphere of solemn dignity, but also of warmth and community gathering. Medieval court procedures reveal a legal system that was far more sophisticated and humane than we might expect. Rather than the adversarial proceedings that characterize modern law, medieval courts often functioned more like community problem-solving sessions, where the goal was not simply to determine guilt or innocence, but to restore harmony and address underlying social problems. The process of bringing a case to court was itself a fascinating ritual that involved the entire community. In many jurisdictions, a person who wished to make a legal complaint had to first raise the hue and cry, literally calling out loudly enough for neighbors to hear, describing the wrong that had been done, and requesting community support for seeking justice. This wasn't simply a legal formality, but a way of ensuring that disputes were genuine community concerns rather than purely personal grievances. Picture a medieval villager standing in the market square at midday, when a maximum number of people would be present, calling out his complaint in a loud, clear voice. "Hear me, good neighbors. I call upon you to witness that John the baker has sold me bread that was short of weight, and I seek your support in bringing this matter before the court." The villagers would gather around, asking questions, offering advice, and discussing whether the complaint seemed legitimate and important enough to warrant formal legal proceedings. This public process served several important functions. It ensured that trivial or malicious complaints were filtered out before they reached the court. It gave the accused person an opportunity to address the problem informally, perhaps by offering restitution or explanation. And it helped build community consensus around the need for formal legal intervention, ensuring that court proceedings had broad social support. Once a case reached the formal court system, the procedures were elaborate and deeply symbolic. Medieval courts typically convened in the early morning, when participants would be fresh and alert, and when a natural light would be optimal for examining evidence and documents. The physical arrangement of the courtroom was carefully designed to reflect the social and spiritual significance of the proceedings. The judge would sit in an elevated position, often beneath a crucifix or other religious symbol, emphasizing that earthly justice was understood to be a reflection of divine justice. The parties to the dispute would stand before the judge, with the accuser on the right side, traditionally associated with righteousness, and the accused on the left. Behind them, arranged in a semicircle, would sit the jury or community representatives who would help determine the outcome. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval courts made extensive use of what we might now call restorative justice practices. Rather than simply determining whether a law had been broken and imposing a penalty, medieval courts often focused on understanding why the offense had occurred and what could be done to prevent similar problems in the future. Consider the case of a young apprentice who had been caught stealing tools from his master's workshop. In a modern court, the focus would be on determining guilt and imposing an appropriate punishment. But in a medieval court, the proceedings might unfold very differently. The court would begin by exploring the relationship between the apprentice and his master. Had the apprentice been properly fed and housed? Had he received adequate training and supervision? Were there personal or family problems that might have contributed to his behavior? The master would be questioned about his treatment of the apprentice, and other community members might be called upon to share their observations. If it emerged that the master had been neglectful or abusive, the court might determine that he bore partial responsibility for the apprentice's misconduct. The resolution might involve requiring the master to improve his treatment of apprentices, perhaps by providing better living conditions or more careful supervision. The apprentice might be required to make restitution for the stolen tools, but he might also receive support from the community to address underlying problems. This approach to justice reflected a deep understanding that most wrongdoing arose from social problems rather than individual evil. Medieval courts were often more interested in fixing broken relationships than in punishing wrongdoers, and they recognized that lasting solutions usually required addressing root causes rather than simply treating symptoms. Medieval courts also made extensive use of symbolic and ritual elements that helped participants process the emotional dimensions of legal conflicts. The taking of oaths was a central feature of most proceedings, but these weren't simply formal declarations. They were understood to be sacred acts that placed the oath-taker under divine protection or judgment. Picture a witness preparing to give testimony in a medieval court. He would be led to a special area near the altar or crucifix, where he would place his hand on a Bible or other sacred object. The oath he would take was not a simple promise to tell the truth, but an elaborate invocation of divine judgment. I swear by God Almighty and by all the saints in heaven that the testimony I am about to give is true and complete, and I call upon the Lord to judge me if I speak falsely. The physical act of oath-taking was accompanied by elaborate ceremony. Candles would be lit, prayers offered, and the entire courtroom would observe a moment of silence to acknowledge the sacred nature of the proceeding. This created a psychological environment that encouraged honesty and discouraged perjury more effectively than any legal penalty. Medieval courts also recognized that different types of disputes required different approaches to resolution. Commercial disputes might be handled through arbitration by merchants who understood the complexities of trade. Family disputes might be referred to church authorities who could provide counseling and spiritual guidance. Community conflicts might be addressed through public rituals of reconciliation. One of the most fascinating aspects of medieval court procedure was the use of symbolic objects and actions to represent legal concepts. A person claiming ownership of land might bring a clod of soil from the disputed property to court. Someone seeking to transfer property rights might perform a ritual exchange of symbolic objects, perhaps a twig and a glove, in the presence of witnesses. These symbolic elements weren't merely quaint customs, but sophisticated legal technologies that helped make abstract concepts concrete and memorable. In a largely illiterate society, where legal documents were rare and expensive, symbolic actions provided a way of creating permanent records that could be witnessed and remembered by the community. The medieval court also served important social functions beyond the resolution of disputes. Court days were often community festivals, when people from surrounding villages would gather not only to conduct legal business, but to socialize, trade goods, share news, and strengthen social bonds. The courthouse would be surrounded by temporary stalls selling food and drink. Traveling entertainers would provide music and stories, and young people would use the occasion to meet potential marriage partners. This festive atmosphere wasn't considered inappropriate or disrespectful. It was understood that justice flourished best in communities where people knew and cared about each other. The social activities surrounding court proceedings helped build the relationships and mutual understanding that made effective dispute resolution possible. Medieval courts also recognized the importance of allowing for cooling-off periods and opportunities for reconciliation. Many procedures included built-in delays that gave parties time to reconsider their positions, consult with family and friends, and explore possibilities for settlement. A case might be continued for several court sessions, with each delay providing another opportunity for the parties to work out their differences. As we sit quietly in this ancient courtroom, surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the sense of centuries of human drama that have unfolded within these walls, we can appreciate the profound wisdom embedded in medieval approaches to justice. These courts weren't perfect, and they reflected the limitations and prejudices of their time, but they also embodied insights about human nature and community life that our modern legal system has sometimes forgotten. The medieval understanding that justice is ultimately about restoring relationships rather than simply punishing wrongdoing offers valuable lessons for contemporary society. Their recognition that legal proceedings should be transparent, participatory, and focused on long-term community welfare provides a model that could enrich our own approaches to dispute resolution. In the gentle evening atmosphere of this medieval courthouse, with its emphasis on community participation, spiritual reflection, and restorative solutions, we encounter a vision of justice that is both deeply practical and profoundly humane. As the evening deepens into night around our medieval courthouse, we turn our attention to perhaps the most fascinating and complex area of medieval law, the treatment of serious crimes and the elaborate procedures developed to ensure that justice was both fair and effective. The courthouse grows quieter now, lit only by the steady flame of oil lamps and the occasional flicker of candles, creating an atmosphere of solemn contemplation that seems appropriate for exploring these weightier matters. Medieval criminal law reveals a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between individual wrongdoing and community well-being. Unlike modern criminal justice systems, which tend to focus primarily on punishment and deterrence, medieval approaches to serious crime were deeply concerned with restoration, redemption, and the maintenance of social harmony. The medieval understanding of crime was fundamentally different from our own. Rather than seeing criminal behavior primarily as a violation of abstract legal principles, medieval law viewed crime as a disruption of the cosmic order that required careful ritual attention to restore balance and harmony. This perspective led to approaches to criminal justice that were both more severe and more merciful than what we might expect. Consider the medieval treatment of theft, which was considered one of the most serious crimes because it violated the fundamental principle of trust upon which all social relationships depended. But medieval law distinguished carefully between different types of theft, recognizing that the circumstances surrounding a crime were often as important as the crime itself. A person who stole bread to feed a starving family might be treated very differently from someone who stole luxury goods for personal enrichment. The court would carefully examine the thief's circumstances, motivations, and character before determining an appropriate response. A first-time offender driven by desperate need might receive nothing more than a stern warning and requirements to make restitution, while a habitual thief might face much more severe consequences. But even in cases of serious theft, medieval law provided numerous opportunities for mercy and redemption. The process of prosecution was deliberately slow and elaborate, with multiple opportunities for the accused to confess, make amends, and demonstrate genuine repentance. Many cases that began as criminal prosecutions ended as civil settlements, with the community working together to find solutions that addressed both the victim's losses and the underlying social problems that had contributed to the crime. The medieval approach to violent crime reveals an even more sophisticated understanding of human psychology and social dynamics. Medieval law recognized that most violence arose from sudden passion rather than calculated evil, and it provided mechanisms for distinguishing between different types of violent behavior. A killing that occurred during a sudden quarrel might be treated as manslaughter rather than murder, particularly if the accused could demonstrate that he had acted in the heat of passion rather than with premeditation. The court would examine the circumstances carefully, looking for evidence of prior planning or evidence that the violence was truly spontaneous. But medieval law also recognized that even spontaneous violence created serious social problems that needed to be addressed. A person guilty of manslaughter might be required to make substantial payments to the victim's family, perform public penance, or undertake a pilgrimage to demonstrate genuine remorse and spiritual transformation. The institution of the pilgrimage penalty reveals the deeply spiritual dimension of medieval criminal justice. Rather than simply locking criminals away from society, medieval law often sought to transform them through spiritual journey and hardship. A convicted criminal might be required to walk hundreds of miles to visit specific shrines, carrying only basic supplies and depending on the charity of strangers for survival. Picture such a penitent setting out from our medieval courthouse on a foggy morning, carrying a simple staff and wearing rough pilgrim's clothing marked with special symbols that identified him as someone performing court-ordered penance. His journey might take months or even years, during which time he would experience poverty, hardship, and dependence on others that would hopefully lead to genuine spiritual transformation. The pilgrimage penalty served several important functions. It removed the offender from the community temporarily, allowing tensions to cool and relationships to heal. It provided a visible demonstration that wrongdoing had been acknowledged and was being addressed, and it created opportunities for the offender to reflect on his actions, encounter new perspectives, and develop the spiritual resources needed for a reformed life. Medieval law also included elaborate provisions for dealing with repeat offenders and those whose crimes seemed to reflect fundamental character defects rather than momentary lapses in judgment. But even in these cases, the emphasis was often on transformation rather than simple punishment. A habitual thief might be sentenced to a period of monastic life, where he would be subject to strict discipline but also receive intensive spiritual counseling and practical training in useful skills. The goal was not to break the offender's spirit, but to provide him with the tools and motivation needed for a law-abiding life. The most serious crimes, treason, murder, and certain religious offenses, did sometimes result in capital punishment, but even these extreme penalties were surrounded by elaborate safeguards and opportunities for mercy. The condemned person would typically have weeks or months between sentencing and execution, during which time they would receive intensive spiritual counseling from priests and have multiple opportunities to appeal for clemency. The actual execution, when it occurred, was understood to be a sacred ritual rather than simply a practical necessity. The condemned person would be encouraged to make a public confession and seek forgiveness from both God and the community. The execution itself would be preceded by prayers, hymns, and other religious ceremonies designed to emphasize the spiritual dimensions of the proceedings. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval criminal law included extensive provisions for pardons and commutations that could be granted right up until the moment of execution. These weren't arbitrary exercises of royal mercy, but rather carefully regulated procedures that allowed the community to reconsider its decisions in light of new evidence or changed circumstances. A condemned person who demonstrated genuine repentance, or whose circumstances had changed in significant ways, or who had received support from respected community members, might have his sentence commuted to imprisonment, exile, or some other less severe penalty. These last-minute reprieves weren't seen as failures of the justice system, but rather as expressions of its deepest values. The belief that redemption was always possible and that mercy should always have the final word. Medieval criminal law also included fascinating provisions for dealing with crimes committed by groups rather than individuals. Collective responsibility was a well-established principle, recognizing that individual wrongdoing often reflected broader social problems that needed to be addressed at the community level. A village where crime rates were unusually high might find itself subject to collective penalties, perhaps fines, restrictions on market privileges, or requirements to provide additional security. But the law also provided mechanisms for collective redemption, allowing communities to work together to address underlying problems and demonstrate their commitment to lawful behavior. The medieval understanding of criminal law as a tool for community healing rather than simply individual punishment is perhaps best illustrated by the elaborate procedures for public reconciliation that often concluded criminal cases. Rather than simply imposing a penalty and moving on, Medieval courts often required formal ceremonies of forgiveness and restoration. Picture such a ceremony taking place in the market square on a sunny morning, with the entire community gathered as witnesses. The offender would publicly acknowledge his wrongdoing, express genuine remorse, and seek forgiveness from his victim and the community as a whole. The victim would be encouraged to offer forgiveness publicly, and community leaders would speak about the importance of moving forward together in harmony and mutual support. These reconciliation ceremonies weren't empty rituals, but powerful community events that helped heal the social wounds created by criminal behavior. They provided closure for victims, demonstrated the offender's genuine commitment to reform, and reinforced community values about forgiveness, redemption, and mutual responsibility. As midnight approaches in our medieval courthouse, and the last oil lamps burn low, we can appreciate the profound wisdom embedded in these ancient approaches to criminal justice. Medieval law wasn't perfect, and it reflected many of the limitations and prejudices of its time, but it also embodied insights about human nature, community life, and the purposes of justice that our modern world could still learn from. The medieval understanding that crime is ultimately a spiritual and social problem rather than simply a legal one offers valuable perspectives for contemporary criminal justice reform. Their emphasis on restoration rather than retribution, their recognition of the importance of community involvement in justice processes, and their belief in the possibility of redemption even for serious offenders provide models that could enrich our own approaches to crime and punishment. In the contemplative silence of this ancient courthouse, surrounded by the ghosts of countless human dramas that have played out within these walls, we encounter a vision of criminal justice that is both deeply practical and profoundly hopeful. A system that sought not merely to punish wrongdoing, but to heal communities and transform lives. As our long evening in the medieval courthouse draws toward its peaceful conclusion, we find ourselves in the quietest hours of the night, when the last echoes of legal proceedings have faded and the ancient stones seem to whisper stories of all the human dramas they have witnessed over the centuries. The oil lamps burn very low now, casting long, gentle shadows across the worn wooden benches and stone floors, creating an atmosphere of profound tranquility and timeless wisdom. In these peaceful moments, we turn our attention to some of the most charming and human aspects of medieval law, the elaborate regulations that govern daily life in ways that reveal the deep concern medieval communities have for fairness, dignity, and mutual care. These laws, which might seem quaint or even absurd to modern eyes, actually represent sophisticated approaches to creating harmonious communities where everyone could flourish. Consider the delightful medieval laws governing the keeping of animals within town boundaries. In an age when the distinction between urban and rural life was much less clear than it is today, most households kept chickens, pigs, goats, and other livestock even in the heart of major cities. The laws that regulated these animals reveal a wonderfully practical approach to balancing individual needs with community welfare. The regulations concerning chickens were particularly elaborate and charming. Chickens were allowed to roam freely during daylight hours, but they had to be confined at night to prevent them from disturbing sleeping neighbors. The law specified exactly how chicken coops should be constructed. They had to be a certain distance from neighboring houses, built with proper ventilation and drainage, and maintained in clean condition. But the chicken laws went beyond simple practical requirements. They also addressed the social dynamics of chicken ownership in amusing detail. If a chicken strayed into a neighbor's garden and caused damage, the owner was required to make restitution, but the neighbor was also required to make reasonable efforts to protect their property rather than simply allowing damage to occur and then demanding compensation. More charmingly still, the laws recognized that chickens had their own personalities and behavioral patterns that needed to be taken into account. A habitually aggressive rooster might be subject to special restrictions, while a hen that was particularly good at finding and eating harmful insects might be granted special privileges to roam more widely than usual. The medieval laws governing dogs reveal an even more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between humans and animals. Dogs were classified into different categories based on their size, breed, and function, with different regulations applying to each category. Hunting dogs belonging to nobles were subject to very different rules than the small terriers kept by merchants to control rats, or the large mastiffs used by farmers to guard livestock. But all dogs, regardless of their status, were subject to the fundamental principle that their owners were responsible for their behavior and well-being. A dog that bit someone, or that consistently disturbed the peace, or that was obviously mistreated, could be the subject of formal legal proceedings that might result in requirements for better training, improved care, or in extreme cases, removal from an unfit owner. The dog laws also included charming provisions for lost or stray animals. A person who found a lost dog was required to make reasonable efforts to locate the owner, but if the owner couldn't be found within a specified period, the finder could claim ownership. However, the law also required that anyone claiming a stray dog had to provide proper care and couldn't simply exploit the animal for labor or profit. Medieval sumptuary laws, which regulated clothing and personal appearance, provide another fascinating window into the values and concerns of medieval society. These laws weren't simply about maintaining class distinctions, although that was certainly part of their purpose. They were also about promoting community harmony, preventing excessive spending that might impoverish families, and ensuring that people's appearance accurately reflected their social roles and responsibilities. The clothing laws were incredibly detailed, specifying not only what different classes of people could wear, but also how garments should be constructed, what materials could be used, and even what colors were appropriate for different occasions. A merchant's wife might be allowed to wear silk, but only in certain colors and only on special occasions. A craftsman might be required to wear a particular type of cap that identified his trade, making it easy for customers to find the services they needed. But the sumptuary laws also included provisions that seem remarkably progressive by modern standards. They often specified that clothing had to be practical and appropriate for the wearer's work, preventing employers from requiring servants to wear impractical garments that would interfere with their duties. They also included provisions ensuring that everyone, regardless of their social status, had access to adequate clothing for warmth and modesty. The medieval laws governing marriage and family life reveal perhaps the most human and touching aspects of medieval jurisprudence. While medieval marriage was certainly shaped by economic and social considerations that modern people might find restrictive, the laws surrounding marriage also show a deep concern for protecting the vulnerable and ensuring that families functioned as sources of support and stability. The laws governing courtship were elaborate and designed to protect young people from exploitation or coercion. Parents and guardians had significant authority over their children's marriage choices, but this authority was balanced by requirements that marriages be based on genuine consent and that young people be given adequate time and opportunity to get to know their potential spouses. The marriage laws also included detailed provisions for protecting wives' property rights, ensuring that women retain control over inheritance and dowry even after marriage. These protections weren't perfect, and they certainly didn't create gender equality by modern standards, but they did provide important safeguards against economic exploitation and abuse. Perhaps most touchingly, medieval marriage law included elaborate provisions for protecting marriages that were struggling. Rather than simply allowing unhappy couples to separate, the law required mediation by church officials, family members, and community leaders who would work to identify and address the sources of marital conflict. The laws governing the care of children reveal the same combination of practical wisdom and genuine compassion. Medieval law recognized that children needed protection not only from obvious abuse, but also from neglect, exploitation, and inadequate education. Parents and guardians were required to provide not only food, shelter, and clothing, but also moral instruction and practical training that would prepare children for adult life. The apprenticeship laws were particularly sophisticated, creating detailed frameworks for ensuring that young people receive proper training while also being protected from exploitation. Masters were required to provide not only technical instruction, but also moral guidance, adequate food and housing, and fair treatment. Apprentices, in turn, were required to be obedient and diligent, but they also had rights that were carefully protected by law. Medieval laws governing the care of the elderly and disabled reveal a society that took collective responsibility for vulnerable community members very seriously. Rather than simply leaving such care to individual families, medieval law created community-wide systems of support that ensured everyone received adequate care regardless of their economic circumstances. The poor laws were comprehensive and surprisingly generous, providing not only emergency relief, but also long-term support systems that help people maintain dignity and independence. Communities were required to provide work for those who were able, care for those who were disabled, and support for those who were too old to work. These weren't charity programs in the modern sense, but rather community obligations that were taken as seriously as any other legal requirement. Medieval guild laws provide another fascinating example of the sophisticated social engineering that characterized medieval jurisprudence. The guilds weren't simply economic organizations, but comprehensive social institutions that provided everything from technical training to social insurance to conflict resolution. Guild law required members to support each other through times of illness, injury, or economic hardship. They had to participate in community festivals and religious observances. They had to maintain quality standards not only for their own work, but for their entire trade. And they had to contribute to community welfare through participation in public works, charitable activities, and civic governance. As the hours pass in our peaceful courthouse, and the first hints of dawn begin to appear at the windows, we can appreciate how these elaborate legal frameworks created communities that were both highly regulated and remarkably supportive. Medieval law wasn't simply about prohibiting bad behavior. It was about creating positive obligations that bound community members together in networks of mutual responsibility and care. The genius of medieval law lay in its recognition that human communities are complex ecosystems that require careful tending to flourish. Rather than assuming that people would naturally behave well if left alone, medieval law created elaborate frameworks of support, guidance, and accountability that help people live up to their better natures. In the gentle pre-dawn light filtering through the courthouse windows, surrounded by the peaceful silence that comes in the deepest hours of night, we can feel the profound wisdom that guided medieval lawmakers. Their laws weren't perfect, and they reflected many of the limitations of their time, but they also embodied insights about human nature and community life that remain relevant today. The medieval understanding that law should serve not merely to resolve disputes, but to build and strengthen communities offers valuable lessons for our own time. Their recognition that individual well-being and community welfare are inseparably linked provides a model for creating more just and compassionate societies. As we prepare for the final chapter of our journey through medieval law, we carry with us a deep appreciation for the creativity, wisdom, and humanity that shaped these ancient legal traditions. In their strange and sometimes wonderful provisions, we glimpse a world where law was understood not as a burden, but as a gift, a set of tools for creating communities where everyone could flourish in dignity and mutual support. As the first gentle rays of dawn begin to filter through the tall windows of our medieval courthouse, casting soft golden light across the ancient stones and worn wooden furnishings, we find ourselves at the peaceful conclusion of our long night's journey through the fascinating world of medieval law. The courthouse, which has been our companion through these quiet hours, seems to glow with a warm, welcoming light that speaks of centuries of human wisdom accumulated within these walls. In these final, tranquil moments, We reflect on the deeper meanings and lasting significance of the strange and wonderful legal traditions we have explored together. What emerges from our exploration is not merely a collection of curious historical artifacts, but a profound vision of what law could be when it serves not just to regulate behavior, but to nurture the deepest and best aspects of human community. The medieval approach to law reveals a fundamental truth that our modern world sometimes forgets: that legal systems are not merely practical necessities, but expressions of a community's deepest values and aspirations. Every strange law we have encountered tonight, from the elaborate regulations governing the sale of fish to the sacred rituals of sanctuary, reflects a society that understood law as a tool for creating beauty, harmony, and meaning in human life. Consider how different our world might be if we approached law with the same creativity and compassion that characterized medieval jurisprudence. Medieval lawmakers weren't content with simple prohibitions and penalties. They created elaborate systems of support, guidance, and restoration that acknowledged the full complexity of human nature and the challenges of living together in community. The medieval understanding that most wrongdoing arises from social problems rather than individual evil offers profound insights for contemporary society. Their emphasis on restoration rather than retribution, their commitment to providing multiple opportunities for redemption, and their recognition that justice ultimately requires healing broken relationships rather than simply punishing wrongdoers. All of these principles remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The theatrical and ritual dimensions of medieval law remind us that human beings need ceremony and meaning, not just efficiency and logic. The elaborate procedures we have explored tonight weren't unnecessary complications, but rather sophisticated technologies for helping people process complex emotions, understand their roles and responsibilities, and find their place within larger moral and spiritual frameworks. Medieval law's integration of practical concerns with spiritual wisdom offers a model for addressing some of the most challenging problems facing contemporary society. Their recognition that individual well-being and community welfare are inseparably linked provides guidance for creating legal systems that serve not just to maintain order, but to promote human flourishing in all its dimensions. The guild system's combination of economic regulation with social support shows how communities can create institutions that serve multiple purposes simultaneously. The sanctuary laws demonstrate how mercy and justice can work together rather than in opposition. The elaborate commercial regulations reveal how economic activity can be structured to serve broader social purposes while still maintaining efficiency and innovation. Perhaps most importantly, medieval law's emphasis on community participation and local control offers valuable lessons for contemporary efforts to create more democratic and responsive legal institutions. Medieval courts weren't distant bureaucracies, but community institutions where ordinary people played active roles in shaping and implementing justice. The restorative approach to criminal justice that characterized much of medieval law provides insights that could transform contemporary criminal justice systems. Their understanding that crime is ultimately a community problem requiring community solutions, their emphasis on addressing root causes rather than just symptoms, and their belief in the possibility of redemption even for serious offenders. All of these principles offer hope for creating more effective and humane approaches to criminal justice. The medieval approach to commercial law, with its emphasis on quality, fairness, and community welfare, offers guidance for addressing contemporary concerns about corporate responsibility and economic inequality. Their recognition that economic activity should serve broader social purposes while still providing adequate incentives for innovation and efficiency provides a model for creating more sustainable and equitable economic systems. As we sit quietly in the growing dawn light, we can feel the presence of all the people who have passed through this courthouse over the centuries: the judges and lawyers, the plaintiffs and defendants, the witnesses and community members who participated in the great human drama of seeking justice and building community. Their struggles and achievements, their failures and successes, their wisdom and folly, all have contributed to the rich tradition of legal wisdom that we have explored tonight. The strange laws of medieval Europe were not merely historical curiosities, but expressions of humanity's ongoing effort to create societies where people can live together in dignity, prosperity, and mutual support. They remind us that law at its best is not a burden imposed from above, but a gift that communities give to themselves, a set of tools for creating the kinds of relationships and institutions that allow human beings to flourish. In the gentle morning light that now fills our courthouse, we can see how these ancient legal traditions continue to speak to contemporary concerns. Their emphasis on community participation, restorative justice, and holistic approaches to human welfare provides guidance for addressing many of the challenges facing our own society. The medieval understanding of law as a sacred calling, requiring wisdom, compassion, and dedication to the common good, offers inspiration for contemporary legal professionals and citizens alike. Their recognition that good law requires not just technical expertise, but also moral imagination and spiritual insight provide a vision of legal practice that could transform our contemporary institutions. As our journey through medieval law draws to its peaceful close, we carry with us not just knowledge of historical facts, but inspiration for contemporary action. The strange and wonderful laws we have explored tonight remind us that human beings are capable of creating legal systems that serve not just to maintain order, but to promote justice, beauty, and meaning in human life. The medieval world we have visited was not perfect. It had its share of cruelty, injustice, and oppression. But it also contained seeds of wisdom that could, if properly cultivated, help us create more just and compassionate societies in our own time. The challenge for contemporary society is to learn from these ancient traditions while adapting their insights to the very different circumstances of our modern world. In the warm, golden light of early morning that now bathes our courthouse, we can envision a future where law serves not just to resolve disputes and punish wrongdoing, but to build communities where everyone can flourish. The medieval vision of law as a tool for creating harmony, promoting human dignity, and fostering mutual care remains as relevant today as it was centuries ago. As we prepare to leave this ancient courthouse and return to our contemporary world, we take with us a renewed appreciation for the complexity and beauty of human legal traditions. The strange laws of medieval Europe have revealed themselves to be not mere historical curiosities, but expressions of humanity's deepest aspirations for justice, community, and meaning. In the peaceful silence of early morning, with the courthouse filled with gentle light and the promise of a new day, we rest in the knowledge that the human quest for justice and community continues. The medieval lawmakers who created the strange and wonderful legal traditions we have explored tonight would recognize in our contemporary struggles the same challenges they faced: how to create communities where people can live together in dignity and mutual support. Their legacy reminds us that this quest requires not just good intentions, but practical wisdom, not just individual virtue, but collective action, and not just rational analysis, but moral imagination. As we drift into peaceful sleep, surrounded by the gentle presence of centuries of human wisdom, we carry forward the hope that future generations will continue this great work of creating more just and compassionate societies. The strange laws of medieval Europe have taught us that law, at its best, is an expression of love, love for community, love for justice, and love for the full flourishing of human life. In this understanding, we find both comfort for the present and hope for the future, as we continue the eternal human project of creating societies worthy of our deepest aspirations and highest ideals. May we rest now in the peaceful knowledge that this work continues, carried forward by each generation as they face the challenges of their own time, with wisdom inherited from the past and hope for the future. In the gentle embrace of dawn, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of centuries, we find the peace that comes from understanding our place in the great ongoing story of human community and the eternal quest for justice.